Good morning. Welcome to Acton University Online for this session on understanding globalism, myths, realities, and challenges. My name is Joshua Greger, a research assistant at Acton, and it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the session, Dr. Samuel Gregg. Dr. Gregg is the research director at the Acton Institute. He's written and spoken extensively on questions of political economy, economic history, ethics and finance, and natural law. He has a master's degree from the University of Melbourne and a Doctor of Philosophy degree in moral philosophy and political economy from the University of Oxford. He oversees Acton's research program and team of scholars and is responsible for oversight of research and international programming. He's the author of 13 books, including For God and Profit, and in the past year, the best-selling Reason, Faith, and the Struggle for Western Civilization. Two of his books have been shortlisted for Conservative Book of the Year. He publishes in journals such as the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, Economic Affairs, Foreign Affairs, and many others. And he writes as well for the Wall Street Journal Europe, First Things, Law and Liberty, National Review, and many other journals as well. He is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and member of the Mont Pelerin Society and the current president of the Philadelphia Society. So for this session this morning, our format will be thus. First, Dr. Gregg will give a recap of the lecture we're discussing, which you can see in the on-demand content if you haven't already. But then we'll have 20 to 25 minutes of questions and answers, and you can submit your questions using the chat function on Zoom. And we will go until, and then before the end, the session will end at 40 past the hour, and 5 minutes before that, we'll have a virtual coffee break in preparation for the next session, which starts at 40 past the hour. So, without any more delay, Dr. Samuel Gregg.
Hello, can people hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, we've had some significant tech issues this morning, so we won't be able, I'm not going to be able to go through and give the 10-minute introduction as we had originally planned. So what I thought I would do is just give you a very quick summary of what my lecture, my presentation was about. Globalization is obviously on many people's minds these days, not just because of trade, not just because of the disruption that increased integration around the world, economically speaking, introduces for cultures, for politics. But we've also seen in, frankly, more recent months, some of the downsides of an interconnected world, right? So if you live in an interconnected world, it's much harder to shield yourself from things like pandemics. In an interconnected world, if one part of the economy, of the global economy starts to have major problems, it's very difficult to shield yourself from those sorts of problems. But one of the things I try to do in my lecture is to take a broader view of the whole process of globalization, because I think we throw this word around in many ways, which are often not helpful, because I think definitional clarity gives us a better sense of what we're talking about when it comes to the issue of globalization. So some of the things I tried to do in my presentation were to make some important distinctions. On the one hand, you have what might be called globalization in a bottom-up sense, by which we mean increasing integration of individuals, of groups, through trade, through technology, through other means which enable us to be in contact with others in ways that we have not been able to be in contact before, at least to the same degree. So that's globalization. Globalism, however, I would argue is something quite different. Globalism is more like a vision of the world as one political community, a vision of the world in which you have global political institutions that make decisions that apply globally. Now, do we have some of those institutions today? Well, not really. I mean, we have organizations like the European Union, which exerts a fair amount of supranational power, but most global institutions, so to speak, don't exert that type of power. So that's a very important distinction. I think it's worth bringing to bear upon some of these discussions. Another thing I think we need to think about is that Globalization in the sense of universalization is not new. We've had globalizations of legal systems. As I point out in my lecture, there's basically 4 legal systems for the entire world. That's, I think, says something about the degree to which the world is legally integrated in ways that we don't necessarily understand. We've also seen, as I mentioned before, economic globalization. In fact, many people would argue that the world was far more economically integrated in the 19th century than it is now. We've also seen globalization in the sense of the rise of empires, or what might be called imperium. And we saw this if you go back through particularly with the rise of modern Europe. You see the Spanish Empire, which was literally an empire that on which the sun never set. For much of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, France and Britain had very large empires which truly had global reach. And then, of course, there is the fact that different religions have assumed a type of global character and faith. Christianity and Judaism, in some respects, have always had a type of universalistic dimension to them. We see the same with Islam. So particularly Christianity and Islam have always had a type of global outlook in the sense of this is a religion for all people, at all times, at all places. So these are some of the things I think that are very important to keep in mind when we're thinking about the nature of globalization. But we also have to, I think, realize that there are some forces which are very much not moving in the direction of globalization, and that's not always necessarily a bad thing. We see, for example, the emergence of the re-emergence, if you might like, of the power of the nation state. Now, for some people, that's worrying because they see that as a short road to extreme forms of nationalism, and potential war. Others, however, say no, these systems are good. These nation states are good precisely because they prevent the massive centralization of power in some of these global institutions, which I mentioned before. We also, I think, need to be more careful in the way that we understand different forms of globalization and the way that they're occurring. So take, for example, economic globalization. It's very clear that we do not live in a world in which every part of the globe is marked by free trade. What we typically have are trade blocs. A good example would be the European Union, or what used to be called NAFTA. So these are trade blocs in which governments essentially negotiate what they want to be the trade relations between one or more countries. So that's not free trade in the sense of there's an abolition of all tariffs and quotas, something which has only really prevailed at very, very specific points of history, and then in those cases, not for very long periods of time. Instead, we find the world is very much marked by trade deals. So when we use phrases like free trade and trade deals, we need to be clear that we live very much in a world of trade deals rather than pure free trade. And that makes a difference when it comes to talking about the nature of globalization. So you might ask, well, what does religion have to do with this? What does religion have to say about the phenomena of globalization? Well, if you look, for example, at Christianity, Christianity clearly has its own vision of universality, that everyone is made in the image of God, that everyone is free to accept the salvation offered by Christ, etc. So in that sense, Christianity has this type of universalistic dimension to it. But at the same time, Christianity also says things like community is important. Christianity has always seen patriotism, which is attachment to a national community, as being a good thing in itself. So what I think Christianity does is, on the one hand, it reminds us that we all have shared common links to each other by virtue of the fact that we are all made in the image of God, and that this means that all mankind is one. There is no superhuman group, there is no subhuman group. We are all equally human. But Christianity has also taken freedom very seriously, particularly the freedom that we find expressed in things like decentralization. So when Christianity talks about freedom in a global context, in a world that has become more integrated, one of the things it tends to talk about, or it should be talking about, is this phenomena of decentralization as mediated through the principle of subsidiarity. And that's very important, because what that means is that you can have economic globalization in the sense that the people are freely trading with each other, people are engaged in a relatively free movement of peoples, etc. But none of this implies that you have to buy into the idea that you need one centralized political authority that claims to make decisions on the behalf of everyone for everyone. So globalization today, I think, as I say in my presentation, is marked by many myths. I think we misstate the nature of globalization. We often confuse different aspects of globalization. There are also realities of globalization, that it's not a new phenomenon, that it has taken different forms at different points throughout different points of history. And then there are the challenges associated with globalization. There are challenges associated with an increasing economic integration of the world. There are also challenges associated with some of the urges on the part of some governments in some parts of the world to have greater political centralization of power. So I think these are some of the questions that believers need to be grappling with when they're thinking about some of these issues of globalization. And above all, they need to avoid falling into the trap of thinking that all globalizations are the same, that all globalizations are equally valid or equally good or equally not so good, and that a fair degree of sophistication is needed when we're thinking about what aspects of globalization have turned out to be very good for the human race and those which present new challenges for humanity as a whole. So I'll stop now and I'll invite questions and comments from the audience.
Yeah, so as I said, you can submit your questions in the question and answer section here, and I will read them out loud so everyone can hear them. So we'll get to as many questions as possible. So we have about 15 minutes now. So Sam, the first question is, so do you think that in the coming years, will national governments transition to a less important role than now with the growth of global organizations like the UN or the European Union? Do you think those continue?
No, in fact, I think the exact opposite. I think the exact opposite. Why do I say that? Well, one, how do countries fulfill their security needs? And I talk about this in my lecture. How do they fulfill their national security needs? They don't look to the UN. They don't look to the European Union. They look to nation states. They look to alliances of nation states. When, for example, people get worried about something happening in the Northern Hemisphere, who do they turn to? They turn to NATO. They don't turn to the European Union for example, military responses to any number of particular questions. Think, for example, about the Yugoslav war in the late 1990s. It wasn't the European Union that fixed that particular problem. It was the intervention of the United States. So that's one thing. I think that when you look at national security needs, countries are not looking to the United Nations. They're not looking to the European Union. They're not looking to supranational institutions to solve these problems. They're looking to nation states and particular nation states. Second, when you look at the emergence of a country like China, no one is looking to the United Nations to deal with some of the very real challenges associated with the emergence of China. People are looking to nation states, particularly the United States, as to how one should deal with some of these problems. Or look, for example, at the recent COVID pandemic. The European Union was very much a bystander to that particular crisis. How was it dealt with? It was dealt with by nation states within the European Union, for example, who actually closed their borders to each other, which is something which directly violates one of the key principles of the European Union, which is free movement between nation states. I also think that there's growing suspicion in large parts of the world about global organizations like the United Nations, like, for example, certain European institutions, organizations. Look, for example, at the World Health Organization. It's a totally discredited organization right now. Why? Because it was unable to show that it could exercise independence from China during the recent pandemic. So, in other words, I don't see nation states becoming less important. In fact, I think the pendulum has now swung the other way. And that's going to present some very real challenges when it comes to questions like economic liberalization. Because on the one hand, economic liberalization produces all sorts of benefits, but it's also clear that you don't have to go with economic liberalization and accept that global institutions are the way of the future, because they're clearly not.
Okay, so related to that, we have another question about China, which you mentioned in your talk. Do you see the future?
Next questions.
Yes. Can you hear me, Sam?
I'm not hearing any more questions right now. Josh, are you there?
Yes. Can you hear me, Sam? I don't know why you can't hear me. Does anyone else hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. We should be able to hear you. Let me pop in that room real quick.
Okay, I'm not hearing any more questions, so I'm going to respond to some of the chat questions which are coming up on, which I can see on the side. I'm being asked a question about Hong Kong, And one of the things about Hong Kong is that this is an example of a small community which is pushing back against the intrusions of a country that is causing all sorts of problems for it. Just one moment. I can't hear the other person.
Can you hear me now, Sam?
Josh Greger is the person I should be talking to, but
Yeah, we can hear you.
I can't hear them.
Sam, can you hear me? I'm unmuted.
Okay.
Yeah, that must be a problem with his headphones.
I still can't hear anything. Josh, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Sam, yeah.
Okay, the audience can hear both Josh and myself, but I can't hear Josh. So I'm going to say some more about some of the questions that are being pushed up on the screen while the tech people try to deal with the problem. One question which I think comes up as a consequence of globalization is what we're seeing now with some of the protests and riots that are spreading across the world in a way which in some respects is unprecedented. Now, what's interesting about this phenomenon, what we see with happening in the United States and in Europe and other countries, is that people are saying, well, this is new because somehow we're seeing events in one country spill over very quickly into another. Well, that's true, but it's not as if that phenomena hasn't happened before. Let's go back, for example, to 1968. 1968 was a world in which the internet did not exist. 1968 was a world in which people got their information from newspapers and to a growing extent, they got it through television. But there was nothing like the instant communication that we have right now. And yet, social protest movements grew very quickly across Europe. They made their way to the United States and vice versa. And it was possible to talk about at least Western European and North American countries as experiencing a type of social moment that was being experienced by everyone else in that part of the world at that particular point in time. Another example of this would be 1989 and 1990 in the former Soviet Union and the former Eastern Bloc. Again, we had social movements emerging which challenged and eventually overthrew communist governments in those parts of the world. Was there more communication available then? Yes, but nothing like the extent that we find today. So I guess this points to the role of technology. This points to the role of instant access to information. And what I think this does is it's not a question of sparking movements. It's not a question of these movements being unable to exist without these forms of technology. What these forms of technology do, I think, is really speed up the pace at which this can occur. Now, that's good if we're thinking about things like liberation from tyrannical regimes, as we saw in the case of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. But I'm not sure that's so good if we're looking at events like, imagine, for example, the events of May 1968 being played out today in our own time. And the events of May 1968 in some respects were far more extensive, far deeper, in some respects even more radical than some of the events that we're experiencing today. So in a world in which those things happen with the technology that and social media that we have today, I would be surprised to see. In fact, I think it would be a lot worse situation. Now, let me say something about another question which has come up about traditional communities. Traditional communities and the challenges that they face socially and economically in the wake of globalization. Well, there's two things I think that we can say about this. One is, obviously, globalization transmits certain forms of culture which happen to be more economically powerful. Now, in the present age, and for a long time, that has been the projection of American norms or Western European norms throughout the world. And this has obviously had a certain impact upon traditional communities in different parts of the world. On the other hand, it's also the case that some of the norms and expectations and customs of what you might call more traditional communities are able to spread via the same process. So if you look, for example, at, let's take an extreme example. Let's take the example of jihadist Islam. One of the reasons it has, which is, if you like, a hyper-traditionalist form of community, one of the reasons it's taken off in some parts of the world is precisely because of many of the benefits, technologically speaking, that globalization has given us. It's also the case that we see traditional communities in Africa and Latin America. Many of their products, many of their customs, many of their ideas are now able to enter into other cultures and spaces at a pace and in a way that is in some respects unprecedented. We see this with things like fashion. We see this with things like music. And I think this is a very good example of how, yes, globalization can introduce fractures. It can introduce disruption and a lot of other unsettling events and movements in more traditional communities or older communities. But at the same time, the same processes give those very same communities the ability to project some of their own ideas and customs in ways that they didn't have before.
So Sam, we have
another question I'm being asked about here. This is a theological question. Is God warning about globalization? Now, I suspect this has got something to do with the Tower of Babel, the biblical narrative of the Tower of Babel, where they basically end up building a tower, which is a way of expressing that they are the equal of God. They are building it. Everyone is building a tower to heaven. And God destroys this, and he throws the world into confusion by giving people different languages. So the motive that's being expressed there is very much one of God warning us against hubris, God warning us against the idea that, yes, we are all one as a human race, but we are still not God. We are still not a being that can somehow be the equal, let alone transcend God. Now, I think actually when we talk about this relationship between how we understand God and globalization, a couple of things can be said. One is, obviously, globalization helps us to realize in some respects that we really are all human, that there are no superhumans and no subhumans. But at the same time, globalization also makes us aware that we are all weak, we are all fallible, we all suffer from what Christianity has traditionally called original sin. So to that extent, I think globalization not only affirms the oneness of the human race, but it also affirms the truth that we are limited, that we lack knowledge, that we are in many respects ignorant, and that we are all sinful. So to that extent, globalization doesn't have to be something that gives us pretensions to being godlike. It can also be something that reminds us of just how insignificant, or maybe that's the wrong word, how much we really are human and not godlike compared to the divinity himself. Another question I've being asked here is about the question of resurgent nationalisms, the resurgent nationalisms. Well, the first thing in the face of globalization, well, the first thing I'll say is that it's very important to make a distinction between patriotism on the one hand and nationalism on the other. Patriotism is legitimate love of country, love of the people that you belong to, love of the heritage that has been bequeathed to you. But it doesn't mean that you dislike other people. Nationalism in the negative sense of the word means my race, my people are better than everyone else. So on the one hand, you have what I call patriotism, this sort of good form of national feeling, national sentiment, which is really about acknowledging where we've come from and paying respect to those who have given us so much. And on the other hand, there's a type of nationalism which takes a very negative view of all other peoples except yourself. Now, the question I think we have to ask is, why are we seeing resurgent nationalism today? Well, I think there's a number of reasons. One is we are learning that free trade and economic liberalization does not make differences go away. A second thing we're learning is that not everyone wins, at least initially, or sometimes even in the medium term, from the process of globalization. So I think when we look at the question that way, what we quickly discover is that nationalism, the way it's working today, it's partly a reaction against this trend towards global institutions. I think if you want to understand, for example, Brexit, what you need to understand is that this was very much a reaction of a majority of the people living in Britain against the sense that those, frankly, unelected supranational bureaucrats in places like Brussels were no longer interested in their concerns and needs. So in that sense, nationalism, this rise of nationalism, is a reaction against some of these global institutions and just how out of touch they are with ordinary human beings. Now, the downside of all this, of course, is that some forms of nationalism, not all, but some forms of nationalism tend to come along with the idea that you can have an economy that is more or less independent from everyone else in the world. We call that autarky in its most extreme form. In other forms, it takes it takes expression in modes like high forms of tariffs, high degrees of subsidies, etc. So it seems to me that the way going forward for many countries is, how do they work out how to balance this sense of wanting to belong somewhere, to be somewhere, from somewhere, to belong to a group of people, alongside the economic benefits and the economic disruptions that are introduced by globalization. These things are frankly not easy to reconcile. They're just not. So to my mind, it seems that one of the challenges we have is, how do we bring these things together in a way that respect national feeling, but also ensure that we gain the full benefits of economic globalization? I'm being told I have a 3-minute warning right now. So, okay, I'm also being told by Josh Greger that he says, I'm not sure why you can't hear me, but it's time. So thank you very much for your time. I apologize for the technical difficulties that we experienced at the beginning of this. and I hope that we won't have any in the short to medium future. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, you're more than free to email me or check me out on the Acton Online app. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. And also for all those who we didn't get to your questions, we will have the chat rooms, which are running continuously, so we can continue the discussion there. Thank you very much. And the next session will start in 3 minutes. Thank you.